Welcome, everyone. We have a very nice sized group joining us today. I can see my counter going up, 3 dozen people already. So that's very gratifying. I know that our speaker, Ian Braun, will be joining us in a moment and promoted to panelist. So here we go. My name is Robert Cherney. I am your host today, and I'll leave that opening screen on for just a moment or two longer. Okay, there's Ian has joined. I think that out of respect for everybody who has joined in so promptly and to use our time well, I'll get us going. Donc, bienvenue à tout le monde qui se joint à ce webinaire avec Ian Braun sur la dénonciation. Yesterday, there was an announcement from Treasury Board that the legislation of 2007 to protect public service disclosure will be reviewed over the next 18 months approximately. So this could not be more than timely, and a special hello to anyone who might be directly involved with that effort. So my name is Robert Cherney. I'm a longtime director and past president of EPAC, of the Ethics Practitioners Association of Canada. You probably all know that you can use your phone line or computer audio. Since we're using the webinar platform rather than the meeting platform, you basically don't see each other, and you have to ask to be allowed to speak. So use the raise hand symbol, which is in the reactions group of signs, and don't mix it up with the applause sign. There's something with a hand that's actually to show that you're applauding, but the raise hand to request speaking privilege is lower down. It's at the bottom of that little menu. You can send written messages in the question box or the chat area. And this webinar is being recorded and will be put up on our website. If you do make any sort of intervention, be as public about yourself or as private about yourself as you wish. And I just want to point out, s'il y a des gens qui veulent s'exprimer en français, je pourrais aider à traduire. Donc, continuons maintenant. And just to point out for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we're an association that began in the mid-90s, and our purpose is to promote ethical practices in organization and to support ethics practitioners across Canada. And practitioners can be active now, retired people, people who are just very interested in promoting that as a practical activity. There are other organizations which do a very fine job on ethics, organizational ethics research. Our focus is making it happen. Our vision is of a world where people in organizations are ethically aware and act ethically. I'm just going to check here one other thing. And yeah, I'm inviting our president, Craig Irvin, to join as a panelist, and that way he can read out our next slide if he wishes. Ian, just unmute yourself and take us through the land acknowledgement. You can make yourself visible too if you wish.
Sorry, are you asking me to make the land acknowledgement or Craig?
Oh, sorry, to Craig.
I am here. Can you? Is my audio working?
Your audio is working, and I assume you look fine.
Okay, I'm not seeing my camera. Here we go. So I just came off of a yes, it was a Teams meeting. I am correct in saying so. So I'm looking for the controls in all the wrong places, but I think I'm connected now. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. Thanks to Dr. Ian Braun for being our presenter this afternoon. And I know that I'm very curious about what you will be sharing with us today. And I know that the rest of you who have joined us are obviously as curious as I am, otherwise you would not be here. So I appreciate that. I'll go ahead and provide our land acknowledgement. So we will begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on this virtual platform, it is important for each of us located somewhere in Canada to recognize the difficult history of these lands. We therefore affirm our commitment and responsibility towards improving relationships with and deepening our understanding of all Indigenous cultures locally and throughout Canada. From coast to coast to coast, we are grateful to live on the ancestral territory of the First Peoples. Please join us in a moment of reflection to consider past harms, as well as some mistakes along the way and how we can each do our part to support truth and reconciliation through ethical awareness and practice. So if you would join me in a moment of reflection, that would be appreciated. All right, thank you so much. And I will hand it back to our facilitator and our presenter.
So I assume that you've read the short biographical notes about Ian Braun. His university education was at Royal Military College, and he served then as a naval officer for a while. Then jumped into the deep end of the water in a different way by becoming a teacher for a while, and was recruited by Transport Canada in 2001. His experience was in the area of maritime transportation security regulations. And after about 5 years of service there, felt that it was necessary to bring forward information about incorrect practices and lack of attention to safety in certain ways. And given the reaction that he was getting up the line, he ended up as a whistleblower. So he speaks from personal experience of sustained reprisal. He turned that into various sorts of work in that area, including advocacy and advice to other individuals, but also academic study. And he completed his doctorate at Carleton University in August of this year on this very topic. And now I'm very pleased to turn it over to Ian. Please, I'm going to stop sharing my computer and you start sharing yours, correct?
Yeah, okay.
And
Thanks,
over
Bob.
to you. And I think that you'll need a half an hour or something like that for your presentation.
About that, yes. Yeah.
And so then after that, we look forward to a very, very lively discussion, Q&A period.
All right, I hope so. Thanks, Bob and Craig. Just share my screen now. Switch to the slideshow. And I'll apologize if this is a bit death by PowerPoint, but it is an academic academic presentation. As Bob was saying, I defended this year, and I'm quite happy to finally have that under my belt and to move on to new projects. So today I'm just going to go over a few things here. I'm going to explain a bit of my background and why I became motivated in this subject. And give a very brief introduction to whistleblowing. I'm going to assume that most of you are more or less familiar with the concepts, but I'll touch on a few things. And then I'll look at my research and how I went about it and what my findings were and what I concluded about whistleblowing. So as Bob was saying, I was a naval officer at one point, and I was also young, as you can see by the picture, not anymore. I got recruited to be the chief of marine transportation security regulations, and I later switched to aviation. it was an interesting field post 9/11 because we were being directed by the United States to implement all kinds of regulations in a very short time frame. And we did it in about a year rather than 4. This created a number of gaps in the regulations. If anybody's developed regulations, you know that one law can refer to another, one set of regulations can refer to another, and so there were discrepancies in there. There was that problem, but there was also some issues that I saw developing around the way the regulations were being implemented and not properly enforced. For example, we had an inspector who sent a ship to a safe anchorage when it refused to disclose its manifest, and then was called up on the carpet for doing so by their director. The action was totally appropriate, and the only reason they were called up on the carpet was because they had cost the company money. So this and some smaller matters within the office were also of concern. For example, some of my bosses were accepting gifts, expensive meals. We're not just talking $50 meals, we're talking $200 meals. There were rumors of golf trips, this sort of thing. In my own office, I had people complaining of harassment. So I brought all these concerns forward with the help of a colleague who was also a chief. She was pushing me to raise these issues both within the department to the integrity officer and up the chain. I later found out that we would go to these meetings and she would turn around 5 minutes later, go back to the person we'd met and tell them that she didn't agree with anything that I had said. I found this out through using the Access to Information Act. In any event, I decided ultimately to put all my concerns into a paper, and I gave it to the Auditor General, to the Committee on National Security Committee, and to the Chief of Staff of the Minister, basically bypassing the routes that we had already tried. And the reaction was pretty much instantaneous and overwhelmingly hostile. There was a short period of calm, and I think I was preserved partly because I timed it so I was moving outside of the department when I dropped the report, because I already had a hint that things wouldn't be right. And I got word that they had a week-long meeting of the senior management team to figure out how to make a reprisal against me. And they came at me 2 ways. One was to allege that I was harassing my superiors, whom I was blowing the whistle on, by making the disclosure. And the second was to suggest that I had leaked confidential information. And in government, if you do that, you get your security clearance yanked and you're essentially unemployable from that point forward. They didn't succeed on the latter. I wasn't so foolish as to give out secret or confidential information. But they were persistent with the harassment. I never saw the full allegations. We attempted to push back, me and other people who were supporting me, through a grievance process. But what happened was the first hearing of the grievance was adjudicated by one of the people we were making the grievance against. And she sat there quite smugly as we pointed this out. I could tell that the fix was in when my union rep got up at the end of the whole thing and talked about a golf outing. So it became clear to me that I was probably not going to win this, at least not through the normal process. I tried other ways through the courts and whatnot. But in the course of this process, I tried to make sense of what was happening to me. And this is quite common apparently with whistleblowers, because you start to think you're a little crazy. And I met other whistleblowers such as Alan Cutler, and we started an organization together to give advice and to advocate for better protections. I'm also now associated with the Center for Free Expression Whistleblowing Initiative, which is also an advocacy group. I was struck by the common themes, not just in my own case, because there were a lot of actors who were cooperating with the wrongdoers in the reprisal, and I couldn't quite understand why they would do this. I saw this across cases with other whistleblowers that I would speak to. Like, I couldn't understand why an entire organization, people, including people who weren't even implicated, would participate in this reprisal. So I thought there was something bigger than just the bad people here, than wrongdoers here. So that's when I started reading, and eventually that turned into my PhD. So now moving on to a bit of the background on what whistleblowing is, to set the terms for people who aren't completely familiar. The most accepted academic definition of whistleblowing is the disclosure by organization members, former or current, of illegal, immoral, or illegitimate practices under the control of their employer to persons or organizations that may be able to affect action. This is a very broad definition. It was made by Michelli and Neer in 1985 and retains its saliency in academia. It's much broader than you'll find in any law, for practical reasons mainly. But there is some disagreement on issues around the periphery, like, who's blowing the whistle. There's a common misconception that whistleblowing is always external. That's not true. It can be internal. And some scholars have pushed back against that, but it's generally accepted that the odds of a reprisal within an organization, even when you're just making it within the organization, are also pretty high. So it's accepted that both internal and external disclosure is wrongdoing. And in fact, many people say it's a process. People will start internally and then they'll take it external only when all internal avenues have failed. Some people say it has to be an employee. It can't be, that it can't be some role-related reporting. And role-related reporting, excuse me, might include somebody like an auditor. The caveat to that is that while an auditor pointing out that something is not good on the books is not whistleblowing, if the organization then starts making a reprisal against that auditor for doing that, then they can become a whistleblower. And there's some consideration whether motivation is a factor. It's generally accepted now that the motivation of the whistleblower is irrelevant, and it's the information that matters. Nobody goes into whistleblowing pure, and nobody comes out of it without some sort of frustration. So it's accepted that you just take that issue out of the equation. Much depends on what you classify as a wrongdoing. Most whistleblowing statutes are pretty narrow about what they consider wrongdoing. Illegality and corruption is, of course, the core of it. Gross mismanagement, it's a fuzzy term, but it usually refers to management practices that a reasonable person would find unreasonable. Unethical practices, they're not always included in Canada's whistleblowing law for the federal public sector. It includes code of conduct breaches, and those include a lot of ethical issues. And generally any action, whether it's intentional or not, so it can be errors, that may result in harm to the organization, the public interest, and health and safety of persons or the environment. Now, I should note that if it's an error, that the only difference is that it may mean that there's nobody necessary to blame for it. It just means that a person disclosing the error should face a reprisal. Now, traditional attitudes to whistleblowing haven't always been very good. This quote here by James Roche really sums up the attitude in the 70s. Basically, whistleblowers were viewed as traitors and disruptive to the organization. This impression began to change over time with a series of corporate and government scandals and deaths. The Ford Pinto, for example, is a very good example. A company made the decision to not recall the Ford Pinto, which had a tendency to explode, killing its passengers when hit from the rear. They decided not to recall them because they did a cost-benefit analysis and determined that it was cheaper to pay off the survivors of the families that died. And then, of course, there was Enron, and there were various government scandals here in Canada. We, of course, had the sponsorship scandal in the 90s, which really focused attention on the issue. People began to understand that maybe whistleblowing did serve a positive role. However, that took some time. So whistleblowing, as I suggested earlier, had been attacked using what are essentially ethical arguments. It was called disloyal in particular, and that it would undermine trust and disrupt operations. These are, the first one is, the loyalty one is is very much a virtue that we're expected to have. Nobody ever talks about to whom it should be directed. And the issue of trust and operations, that's more utilitarian reasoning. You know, we want the best outcome for the company. We don't want it to be disrupted by this whistleblower. We can handle it internally if we're just told about it. But these arguments gradually weakened over time because of the repeated failures I spoke about a couple of minutes ago. And now it's accepted that it's actually beneficial to have a good whistleblowing system in place because it allows the organization to quickly identify and fix the problem with a minimum loss of control. The regulator doesn't have to step in and take control. The organization's existence isn't threatened. As in Enron, you can see that if you don't pay proper attention to whistleblowers, the organization can disappear completely. And some scholars have said that, you know, it's better to put your loyalty with the goals of the organization because these can go adrift. Only criminal organizations have illegitimate goals. And whistleblowers in criminal organizations get the term snitch. Unfortunately, that term was at one point transferred to legitimate whistleblowers. So when you think about it, for a long time, we were labeling people acting in the public interest as criminal snitches. It's viewed as a pro-social act. And by that, it means it's not entirely altruistic. The whistleblower can benefit from the end of the wrongdoing, whether it be contamination of rivers or the air, and in addition, they can be vindicated by a good finding on their whistleblowing. And I just list some of the reasons for whistleblowing law, why they put them in place. Open information is the big one here. Is that people, citizens, shareholders and corporations have a right to know what's going on inside that organization because they're invested in it in one way or another. Canada's PSDPA, the Public Service Disclosure Protection Act, says that it tries to balance free expression rights with the duty of loyalty to the employer, which is a traditional common law duty. So the whistleblowing experience, this basically goes over what happens to the typical whistleblower. They see some wrongdoing. They have to decide whether they're going to report it. Usually they go through a bit of an investigative process to figure out whether they have it right or wrong. And then they'll try internal channels. The supervisor is the most likely person to get the disclosure first. As I said, it's a process. They might proceed after that. Usually it's fixed. The problem is those stats are never caught in any whistleblowing study except the one in Australia, the Whistling While They Work study, which looked at a whole bunch of different organizations using surveys. But we don't hear about those cases because the people report the issue and it gets fixed and they don't think of themselves as a whistleblower and they move on. The organization moves on, problem's fixed, no problem. But if it doesn't work and reprisals begin to mount, the organization may ultimately decide to go outside the organization. And that's where the harm really gets bad to the organization and the reprisals can get really, really ugly if they haven't already. The problem is that persistence is quite often perceived as unreasonableness, and positions will harden. Each side will start sticking to their guns, and it can get particularly ugly. And usually the big loser is the whistleblower. Not always, though. If the organization makes strategic errors along the way, they can lose. And logically, the outcome will depend on the seriousness of the wrongdoing, who is implicated, and the dependence of the organization on the different actors. This just makes sense. If you're implicating the CEO of the corporation, you can expect them to make a reprisal pretty quickly, and pretty strong one at that. So as I was saying, one of the things that that perplexed me was why these regimes, which had been accepted and legitimized by governments through laws, why weren't they working the way that they should, as in my case? Why was there still this institutional reaction? So I decided to look at it from the institutional perspective. Now, institutional theory just says, this is basically on the premise that as individuals, we work within large institutions, and these are essentially rules that we agree to abide by. And we can even have our preferences altered by these. So I'm not just looking at the psychological factors that individual actors are considering. I'm looking at how everybody in the organization might be affected by the norms, the structures, the rules, that sort of thing. As I was saying, the previous approaches used more of a psychological and sociological theory to study the outcomes. They looked at individual actors, the dependence of organizations on these actors, to see how to try to predict how the organizations would react to whistleblowing and whether there would be reprisal. The two types of institutionalism I used were historical. And historical looks at the past basically to the present, and it focuses very much on how previous choices affect how institutions evolve to the current day. It's a backward looking. But there's also rational choice institutionalism, which looks at how incentives work and how regimes such as whistleblowing regimes can be designed to work in an existing institutional framework, because it's not just the whistleblowing regime. These are being placed within Westminster governments, such as we have here in Canada, the UK and Australia, and New Zealand, of course. These two different theories allowed me to look at the past and the present and make some determination on whether the incentives were working in the way that they should. The preliminary literature review, I used that to identify what I thought might be happening. And then I started to go out and I started looking for data. I spoke to interviewers. I did lots of interviews, about 70. I looked at legislation, policies, anything I could find. I looked at government communications, which are more of a publicity exercise quite often, but will also signal their goals and intents. And then I looked at legal administrative records, meaning I went through whistleblowing cases, legal databases, and of course, media reports. One of the things that is really relevant here is to understand what Westminster conventions are. Because I was looking at public service, I had to consider what the expected role of public servants within our government is. It's different than the US, of course, but just looking at the parliamentary system that we use, there are several premises that are really important, the conventions as they're called. First is that the minister is responsible for what goes on in the department. It's not everything. It's usually broad policy issues that they have a direct hand in their own conduct, but the convention is that when it comes time to answer for what's happened in a department, it's the minister that stands up in Parliament and answers for it. Public servants may have been the people who made the mistake, but there's this acceptance that there's a bit of a separation between the political and administration. The minister will take responsibility, but the accountability is quite often on the administrative side. This Schaefferian bargain, this was theorized or described first by Schaeffer in the 1970s, and it basically sets out what civil servants can and can't do under this traditional convention, under these traditional conventions. You're expected to speak truth to power, but the advices should be confidential. But at a certain point, a matter is settled, and then you loyally implement. And the other thing is that the civil service is appointed on merit and has security of tenure. So just because you disagree with the minister doesn't mean you get fired. You're expected to implement it, but you don't get fired just because you have a disagreement. They can't just put in their favorites. The one exception to that might be deputy ministers at the very top, who can be moved around more easily. So after doing all of this research, and it was a huge project, let me tell you. Yeah, I could have probably done a dissertation on each one of the cases, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia. But it was useful because it allowed me to do some cross-case comparisons on how whistleblowing works in these governments. The first thing that I noticed was that when they were building up to these regimes, what they did was they went through a series of steps that had a lot of parallels in it. First of all, the traditional bargain on the role of public servants began to be eroded. There was a lot of suspicion in the 70s that civil servants were basically out for their own good. And this was reflected in that program, Yes Minister, which many of you will be familiar with, a very cynical view of how the public service works. And the scandals and disasters in the 80s were started being broadcast 24/7 on news channels as cable really expanded. Jurisdictions would first generally try transparency measures, such as Freedom of Information Acts or access to information here in Canada. And then they would go to codes of ethics. There was a lot of resistance at first to codes of ethics for different reasons. And then finally, when all of these other systems failed, they would say, well, okay, we've got to have a whistleblowing law. And they often copied from each other when doing this. These regimes offered a solution to a problem of legitimacy. And by that, I mean, the government was in some sort of crisis. Say there was a scandal, say there was some sort of major administrative issue that could have been prevented, and they realized that whistleblowing may have been a way to solve this, and they want to signal to the electorate that, yes, we're taking action on this, yes, we're taking this seriously, and going forward, we're going to be better about this. And it could be the same party that was responsible for the problem, or a new party. Usually it's a new party which will pick up the banner, which is certainly what happened in Canada and the UK. Administrators are generally reluctant. They prefer the traditional convention where you keep silent and keep things internal, but the political actors will overrule them in general. And as you can see, over about 15 years, each of the jurisdictions implemented whistleblowing protections, although Australia's states were very early. They started in 1993 due to scandals in their jurisdictions. So how do these regimes work, and do they work at all? Do they meet their objectives? So what I found in this study was that there are generally three types of approaches to laws. The first two, protections and structural, are the core of Westminster whistleblowing laws. They say that if you come forward, we will protect you so you can come forward, and then they create the avenues to make those disclosures safely. Financial incentives are they're controversial. There's a feeling that they contaminate the ethical aspect, the altruistic aspect of whistleblowing. It works particularly well in the financial and pharmaceutical sectors, areas where you need an expertise to find the wrongdoing, and where your career will be destroyed if you speak up. The logic of these regimes is pretty much similar. All of them have essentially the same avenues for disclosure. They might have slight differences, such as for some kinds of wrongdoing, you might go to a commission. The UK is the most different. The evidence on performance, however, is quite weak. The problem is that none of these regimes collect really good data. And part of that is because they don't even have a properly developed understanding of how these regimes should work. No theory of change, no logic model, no performance framework, no identification of meaningful performance indicators. And the laws might have some reporting requirements, say for a number of people who have asked questions, number of people who have made disclosures, but this information is so devoid of any context, and you can't even go back to look at whether those cases that were rejected had any validity to them or not, that it's essentially useless. There's no satisfaction of the users considered. There's no measurement of baseline wrongdoing within the organizations, nothing like that. Such as improved governance, trust in the regime, generally aren't looked at all. Although the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner released an internal study this year that showed that it's not trusted, and that may be what's prompting this action to review the federal whistleblowing law here in Canada. There's disillusionment across all jurisdictions. I spoke to stakeholders in each of the countries I looked at. Nobody feels their regimes are working all that well. Although of the three, the one that seems to be working the best for whistleblowers is the UK regime. And the UK regime is unique in that it applies to all workers in the UK, not just public servants. And they've set up a specialist tribunal. The employment tribunal hears these cases. I shouldn't say it's specialist. They go to the tribunal and they can have their cases heard. And there has been some experience developed there, but the decisions remain variable. They're not great, and they're dropping over time. So, you know, if you've just lost your job for whistleblowing, getting £10,000 is hardly compensation, and the average now seems to be around £10,000 to £13,000. So what is causing this? So I dug into the various cases and into my interviews to try to figure out what it was that was causing this. And what I found was that the regimes had been designed to be consistent with traditional Westminster conventions. So they favored going up the chain of command and generally punish going external. The levels of justification to go external vary from next to impossible to meet to, in the UK, it's more of a tiered process. So if you can establish that it hasn't been dealt with properly earlier, that you can go externally and still be protected. But this is hard to prove. So in general, where we have just public sector regimes, they really try to push you through the traditional channels without considering the effects of the existing norms within those organizations. And as you can see here, the hierarchical norms remain hostile. They distort the concept of loyalty, where they see it to the superior, not to the minister or the public interest. And they inhibit honest advice. So people don't want to send bad news up the chain is the core of that. And some spoke of a clay layer of middle management preventing any kind of real news reaching the top levels of senior management. Frank advice is grudgingly accepted, but, and by this I mean a disclosure that something is wrong, but persisting in this is seen as unreasonable. It's like, we've made our mind up now, so shut up about this issue. It's not important anymore. And confidentiality is increasingly just secrecy. And you see this in the habit of not keeping proper records anymore. That's one big thing. Nobody wants to be scrutinized. Nobody wants to have their work scrutinized anymore. One interviewer said that they used to provide options analysis, and they were told not to do so anymore because somebody might ask for that through a Freedom of Information request. One of the big things I found, though, was that there's been a blurring between the political and the administrative sides. Political interference administration has become quite a lot easier now that there are a lot of these exempt employees, as they call them here in Canada, but they exist in Australia and in the UK. Australia has even more than we have here. And they've also taken... Political actors have also taken control of incentives, so they can deny performance pay to anybody they view as a non-performer or as a dissenter. They can deny promotions. This has become increasingly entrenched in different governments. And neither employment law nor free speech rights have had a significant effect on outcomes. The duty of loyalty remains dominant in this. Problems with the investigations and oversight, particularly at the departmental levels, are a big problem. You can expect more professionalism from a commissioner or an ombudsperson in making their investigation and in their reporting of findings. But there are no real standards at departmental levels. They're set by the deputy minister or the permanent secretary or whomever it happens to be, the chief executive. So observations on ethics. This is, of course, relevant to this because whistleblowing often involves ethical breaches as well as breaches in law. Organizational leadership on ethics, competence and workload were frequently cited. I had senior officials saying, we're just so busy and we have so many demands, we can't always get to these smaller issues. It got to the point where some would say, you know, these people are just making my life difficult. I can't do my job because I've got too many demands, and having somebody come in and investigate is going to disrupt my operations for 2 years. Whistleblowers are the poor cousin in the regimes. That's another problem. The regimes really focus on the wrongdoing, but what's forgotten is how to take care of the whistleblower, and training and awareness is a huge part of this. And there are a few jurisdictions that really, really do this well. This has been pointed out in other studies as well. Confidentiality remains the main protection, but it's imperfect. It can be broken. Sometimes people know who spoke out, either because they said it themselves or because they're the only person who could have known this was the wrongdoing. And other protections are retroactive. So these regimes allow you to get compensation usually years after the whole thing has gone down. So that gives the wrongdoers a lot of time to cause damage. The laws don't treat the whistleblower and the organization equally. Almost uniformly, organizations have more rights to comment on the investigation and give input than the whistleblower does. Many whistleblowers spoke of not being able to rebut what was obviously false evidence. And they're generally treated with suspicion. And finally, the public interest suffers because the wrongdoing ends up being buried forever. In Canada, once you've taken an issue to the Public Sector Integrity Commissioner, it's no longer accessible through freedom of information or anything. So wrapping up, my conclusions are that the regimes were established to bolster legitimacy. Weak or new governments seek to restore or establish their reputation of integrity. They're at least partly symbolic. Some people would say cynical. I'm not willing to go that far. But for political actors, there's a big part of it. Symbolism is a big part of it. Success appears to be dependent on political and administrative support, and that just makes sense. The problem is that politicians quickly move on to other issues. I heard one advocate say, you know, we raised the issue of improving the law, and the politician said, oh, I thought we'd already dealt with that, as if it was just closed. They didn't care anymore what was going on. And that leaves administrators with the power. And they're usually resistant to the regimes because they see it as a threat to their reputation in case something gets out, a threat to their authority, and maybe they have more prosaic concerns about the effects on accountability. And trust in use will remain low where you don't have positive outcomes. If people can't see the regime is working, then they won't use it. And that's something that they found at PSIC as well. But despite that, the regimes do seem to be serving the roles of powerful actors. They can at least point to it and say, hey, we've got something. So, you know, get off our backs. They do appear to be designed in some to conform to local Westminster conventions, norms, and incentives, but they didn't account for the institutional drift or for what has emerged as whistleblowing best practices. Like I said, the intrusion of political actors into administration has not been helpful, and that improvements will likely require a series of changes and possibly another crisis to trigger them. And that is it. I'm sorry, I think I ran a little long there, but if you need to contact me, this is my contact info. I'm happy to give advice to anybody who wants it.
Well, thank you very, very much, Ian. It was time certainly well spent. While I wait for people to either raise their hand using the little symbol. Oh, here we have one person already. So please, just to tell people, you raise your hand. I have to find you on my list here. I hit the symbol that says allowed to talk. I've just done that. And so now, S. Bratchler, please go ahead, unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Ian. It's Sharon Bratchler from Saskatchewan. We talked at the last conference in Vancouver. I have a very nitty-gritty question, which I appreciate may not fall within the purview of your research, but it's sort of a very practical piece. The interface that a whistleblower would like to have, and I'm going to say it as a homogenous proposition, which isn't true, but I'm just going to put it out in that way. I'm debating the way in which a whistleblower can interact with our office. And I'm debating just having a very streamlined, they can have direct access to me, and then I deal with it in terms of where it goes next. And I'm just wondering if your research showed anything in terms of the method of interface as the entry level, in terms of what influence that could have on a whistleblower coming forward, feeling comfortable in the process, and engaging and continuing with the process.
Well, there's two ways I can answer this, and tell me if I'm missing your question, the answer that you're looking for. But one was that I heard from quite a few people that they really appreciated the one door approach. So the idea that they could go to somebody, and that even if they didn't get it right, they didn't get the office right of where they were supposed to go, that person would direct them to the correct avenue. And they saw that as a positive, because what they perceived was that people were getting disappointed and perhaps disillusioned when they'd go to one person's office and be told, no, you're in the wrong place. So that's the one side of it. The second side of it is that they appreciated having a separate office to go to, and even senior executives agreed, sometimes reluctantly. The further away the disclosure gets from them, the more uncomfortable they become. But they accept that, well, Parliament decided that we needed a separate avenue for disclosing wrongdoing, and it makes sense that there be an office that goes around the chain of command in case the chain of command is in some way not receptive, or worst case scenario, corrupted. So they do like that. Does that answer your question, or is there another dimension you're looking for?
I'll interject here, and because we have at least 3 written questions. The first one that came in was that asking, can you characterize quickly the sorts of people you interviewed?
I looked at different groups. I looked at people who were considered recipients of disclosures. So these might be internal integrity officers or ombudspersons. I looked at, I spoke to commissioners themselves. So these would be what I called quasi-internal avenues. They're still within government institutions, but they're separate from the department where the alleged wrongdoing took place. I spoke to advocates, a lot of advocates, and to some whistleblowers. Whistleblowers, I typically looked at their individual cases to see if what happened to them matched what I was being told should happen by senior executives in departments. So I spoke to a few clerks and ADMs, that kind of level. And then, of course, I spoke to other academics who had a lot of practice and experience in ethics and in dealing with government misconduct and error. I tried to have a really broad base, and I was, of course, cognizant of my own bias. Being a whistleblower gives you a real sense of how horrible it can go wrong, but it can also make you a little bit negative to input from the other side. So I had to lower those defenses a little bit and say, okay, I need to listen to this person as they're speaking to me. And nobody spoke to me in a way that I found dishonest, but I did find that there were blind spots. Everybody has blind spots, of course. And one commissioner from, a deputy commissioner actually from Australia, said that he found the same thing. He said they'll take actions that he said these are smart people. They didn't get to their jobs by being stupid, but they'll take these actions that are clearly reprisal. I said, well, what's going on here? And that's sort of fed into the idea to me that there are perhaps these prevailing norms and accepted practices within these organizations that are subconscious. People they're not even aware they have them.
Thank you, Ian. I'm going to combine 2 of the written questions that I've received here. One person says, thank you, Ian. It is difficult to discern a hopeful message in this. are there things that you see that do offer hope for things to improve? And I'm combining that with a question, what best practices did you identify with respect to responding to whistleblowers? I heard what you said regarding responding to evidence about in the organization. Is there anything else?
So in terms of the hopeful message, it's actually linked to the second question, which is the best practices. These are evolving. There's more and more experience. The United States has had a law in place since 1978, and for them it's been very much a whack-a-mole exercise. They pass a law, somebody finds an exploit that creates a loophole, and then they have to amend the law to fix it. And they've been doing this for 40, 50 years now. But there are now some fairly mature best practices. I'm working with one that we've developed at the Center for Free Expression, but the Government Accountability Project in the US has one. Transparency International just released their own. The European Union has one. So it's not, the good news is that we know how to fix these laws. The bad news is, well, not necessarily bad news, the challenge is getting policymakers to see how these laws can be improved. And a lot of that deals with the interface between law and practice. So you can have a great law, but if you have officials who don't really understand the goal of the law, the fundamental goal of the law, or aren't perhaps enthusiastic in its enforcement for whatever reason, you have to be aware of where those weak links are. And I mentioned earlier about departments having weaker standards than commissioners' offices or ombudspersons are. Nobody's perfect. I mean, there's a lot to be found wrong in various commissioners' offices and ombudspersons' offices, the way they've handled disclosures. But by far the weaker link is at the departmental level. So if this experience that's being evolved within commissioners and ombudspersons' office can be transferred to departments, that would be a huge improvement, for example.
Okay, thank you. I'll read one other question, and I do invite other people to raise their hands. Here's a question. Do you see any major difference between Canada and the other jurisdictions, which would account for our much weaker situation?
Well, I mean, looking at it from a strictly legal perspective, and this is outside the scope of my dissertation because I didn't look at the laws, I didn't compare them side by side. But David knows, of course, that I have done this comparison for various jurisdictions in Canada. And the laws, they fall short in a number of areas. For example, like I was saying, they don't put protecting the whistleblower front and center. That's really important. You have to ring fence the whistleblower, because if the whistleblower dies, so does the disclosure. And that was expressed to me by a number of people. And it just makes sense. I mean, there's nobody to champion the issue anymore. And what's more, it sends a message to the organizations that people in the organization that you better keep your mouth shut. The other problem is, I mean, there's nitpicky things like the reverse burden of proof in these laws. Very few of them have a reverse burden. Whistleblowers have a very hard time getting through courts successfully because most judges treat them as ordinary employment disputes, which they're not. You have an organization pitted against a whistleblower who has few resources while the organization has a lot. And the organization is trying to preserve itself at this point. This isn't just some pay issue that we're talking about. So the problem is that when you don't have that reverse onus, you only have about a 2% success rate for whistleblowing cases, but it's 20% if you have that reverse onus. It's still not great, but it's vastly improved. The other issue is that there's a real problem with where these cases are heard. In the UK, they go to employment tribunal, which at least is used to handling this employment disputes, so will give out some money at least. Whereas in Canada, it's been a complete and utter failure at the federal level. Anybody who's gone in front of the tribunal, and there's only been two, has fallen completely on their face. It's been a real tragedy, and and I've read the rulings in some of these, and it's appalling the ignorance on the part of the judges. So you need a specialist court with trained adjudicators. Some people have also proposed a separate office of the whistleblower. I mean, I could go on and on, but those are kind of the big things that I see.
Thank you. I'll invite Craig Irvin, our president, to pose a question.
Sure, thank you. First of all, I really found that presentation quite interesting and informative. And during the presentation, you mentioned that in the period of time when we had access to 24-hour news channels and cycles and so forth, we really saw this kind of pressure to make a change in the way that these kinds of situations were handled and processes around developing better ways to handle them. I'm just wondering that, now that we're in this kind of accelerated technological space, have you, maybe in your conversations, has this been identified as a potential to perhaps refine and make the tools that are currently available even more efficient, even around perhaps protections, anonymity, those kinds of things?
Well, definitely. The idea that there are secure channels. You can use online secure channels. It used to be the brown envelope, right? You'd send the brown envelope, and nowadays you have these secure drop sites that you can use. That has definitely helped. It's as to I'm not sure if you're talking about social media per se. It certainly has made people savvier, I think, about the hazards of whistleblowing, because these stories get disseminated much more quickly. And in response, you've had some whistleblowers recently who have essentially hired public relations firms before coming forward. And I have a friend, and he thought that was a bit scandalous, and I was thinking, no, this is a great idea. You want to come out with the right message. So a lot of whistleblowers in the past, they didn't know where to turn. Now with the internet, you can go online, you can find advice sites, even if it's not in your own country, there will be advice from other countries. So people are a lot better informed about that, about how to bring their issues forward. So.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, is both that kind of the internal mechanisms, whether we're seeing more robust internal mechanisms from a reporting perspective, but also externally, social media, websites. You mentioned Transparency International and some other organizations that do a lot of work in this space, or at least part of their work touches on this, which adds to that availability of knowledge, which again, as to your point, as you stated a moment ago, helps to encourage those who might not otherwise feel that this is something that's possible. It gives them that sense that maybe by doing this, I am doing the right thing, and it will be understood as such.
Well, the evil twin to that, though, the flip side of the coin to that, is that people also see how the stories can go badly, right? I mean, you had. There's no shortage of cases on the internet where whistleblowers have been absolutely crushed, even prominent ones like Vindeman in the U.S. and I mean, there's lots of cases here in Canada where that's happened. What's been interesting is that there's been a bit of a drop in like we've seen as an advocate and an advisor to whistleblowers. There's been a bit of a drop in people coming forward with questions, and whether that's the question of they still don't know where to go, or whether they're just so distrustful of the current regimes, I'm not sure. I'd have to look into that more.
Thank you, Ian. A couple of other questions came in, and I'll just pose both of them so that you can deal more quickly. Don't you think that there's a serious need to have a chief philosophy officer in every department to provide continuous ethical upgrading? And the next one, with what you know now, is there anything you would have done differently in your own whistleblowing?
Well, I'll answer the first one first. In Ontario, they actually have an ethics executive. That's their departmental recipient for disclosures. They don't actually have disclosures through your chain of command, although that should be protected by common law. I think it's probably a good idea. The bigger question is, would they be listened to? I mean, there are already integrity officers in government departments, and things still go wrong. It doesn't mean that the person that gets appointed to that position is going to be the right person. It doesn't mean that even if the person is the right person, they can be shut out of the organization by hostility from their what are essentially their peers, right? I even had one integrity commissioner say to me that they were viewed as a traitor, and I was gobsmacked when I heard that. What do you do when you face that?
I just want to interject here. I think that you've taken the question within the context of existing kinds of thinking where ethics officers are basically transactional. I think the questioner is asking something about organizational culture, which accepts the idea that there has to be the constant possibility of reflection and improvement, and not just business process re-engineering kind of improvement,
Right.
but actual awareness of what we are as human beings and where we fit in a moral universe.
So the answer is yes. I think that would be a great thing to have, and because I did sense that there was a bit of drift in the norms and values of senior administrators, and it wasn't necessarily a malicious thing. It was just they're all kind of conditioned to think the same way. You need somebody who can step back and say, yes, but is that ethical? That would definitely be a benefit. The only thing I might add, semi-seriously, is that you might need to extend some protection to them as well in terms of whistleblower protection, because they're inevitably going to find some sort of misconduct.
The older tradition is the court jester,
Right.
who was given license to tell the truth.
Right. Yes. As long as it was funny. But yes, in answer to the second question, would I have done anything differently? Oh, I'm not even sure I would have blown the whistle. It's a terrible thing to say, because in my own case, it neither resolved the problem. The people who were implicated went on to make decisions that led directly to the Lac Mégantic disaster. And it didn't improve the environment of the department. I was told by other people that the message was sent, anybody good left. But if I were to try a different approach, I'm not sure any of them would have worked, to be honest. I'm not sure that the law that exists as it is now would have ever picked it up. I might have tried working internally more, just doing what some experts advise, just building a coalition and then stepping forward as a group. It's tricky though, because you'll start with allies and then suddenly you'll be standing there all alone. So maybe I would have been a little bit more strategic in my thinking, but if I was doing a rational cost-benefit analysis, I would not have blown the whistle at all.
And I'd like to tie that response back to the quote that you displayed of who was that person?
Roche
or something?
Yeah, Roche. Yeah.
Underlying it, I thought was the idea that it is impossible for an organization to be wrong or to be evil.
Yeah.
I mean, you said that criminal organizations, set out to be evil, but the GM fellow seemed to say that a priori, anybody who does this is obviously sabotaging a perfect organization.
Yes, and
is that not perhaps the case? I mean, we've turned organizations into legal persons, and those legal persons put up a fight for themselves.
It's very true, and it reminds me of something that my friend and colleague David Hutton said, is that the heads of these organizations often forget that there's a wrongdoer involved in the equation, and the people who design these regimes as well, I would say, and that you can design a regime that seems fair, but you're forgetting that there is somebody with a lot of power who is the wrongdoer and can control the levers. and they're not necessarily going to tell the big boss that that's an issue. So it's a huge blind spot. I would agree. And organizations, of course, I mean, they're just collections of people. You're inevitably going to have some wrongdoing somewhere.
Well, thank you very, very much, Ian. We're getting close to our finishing time here. Oh, there's one more that just came in. Would you substantively change the orientation of Canada's federal whistleblowing regime with its 2 tiers of disclosure? Is there any value left with having departmental integrity officers?
Oh, I absolutely do think there is that you should have a departmental integrity officer. Because the chain of command may be implicated in whatever wrongdoing it is, either directly or by failing to deal with it. So having that person within the department is important, but the appointment process has to perhaps be carefully scrutinized. And I'm not in any way suggesting I spoke to anybody who was not a good candidate for the office, but it does generally have to be somebody who is protected themselves from reprisal from the organization. I would suggest that that having oversight of their mandates would be good by an outside body, whether it be from a public accounts committee, a government operations committee, to vet their processes, just to make sure that things are running smoothly, that the processes are generally good. And I would also suggest that one thing that would have a salutary effect would be to have disclosures be able to be escalated when they're not properly dealt with at one level, all the way up to external. It would provide a powerful incentive for internal people to fix the problem quickly.
Very interesting. Before I turn this over to Craig to thank you, I'd like to throw out 2 challenges to our listeners. First of all, because there's been this announcement that Treasury Board will supervise a review of the public service disclosure protection legislation over the next 18 months, if find some way to communicate your thoughts, and one channel that you could use is EPAC generally, and Ian Braun specifically, whom you can reach through EPAC. Ian is one of our directors now. So do participate in that in any way that you wish. The other challenge arises out of one of the points that you made, Ian, about the lack of data. And back about 15 to 20 years ago, when in my consulting work, I had worked in the federal government for 21 years, and then I had clients in the federal government. And some of my work had to do with organizational climate surveys, employee satisfaction, all that kind of stuff. And in a few of those surveys, I asked a series of questions about whether if people had a problem along these lines, whether there was a way within the organization that they knew of to bring it forward, and whether their expectation was that this would be dealt with fairly, or whether they simply wouldn't do anything, or they would automatically go outside. So questions of that sort. I haven't looked up my questions since then, so I'm not quoting them. But think about that. What kind of questions would you want to ask within organizations to check whether or not there was trust, and whether there was awareness of these channels, whether there was awareness of any policies, and then whether there was trust in them. I certainly would find that very interesting to hear suggestions of how that could be investigated. And Ian, you seem to be nodding. Yes. Okay. There was a message that David Yazbek is also on the task force and might welcome direct comments. Okay. Craig, over to you, and then we'll close up.
Sure. I'd just like to, add to your comment, Robert, the issue of trust and how important that is to really kind of providing, I guess, the incentive, or at least the encouragement that that people do come forward if they do notice that there's something egregiously, wrong or erroneous in the system, in the process, or in the procedures, policies, etc. And I would just, mention that the Edelman Trust Barometer does a kind of a yearly inventory globally of, citizens in various countries. I'm not sure if it's all countries, but most countries across the globe, and their attitudes towards trust in organizations and politicians, the press, and other kinds of components. So that might be interesting as well for folks to take a look at, because sometimes those two components align well, whether or not people are willing to come forward and whether or not they trust the institutions to support their actions. But I would like, of course, to thank Dr. Braun for sharing his research insights with us today. I thought, as I mentioned before, this was really interesting, and I think a very important topic, one that extends across all organizations, and hopefully, as Robert suggested, we will collectively take some time to think about this and reflect on some of the findings that you reported on, some of the things that we can do as citizens, as people inside of organizations, to ask questions and to maybe bring some of these topics forward for conversation. So thanks again so much for taking the time today, and thanks to all of you for joining us.
I echo that last thanks. Please send us feedback. We'll leave the software going for a few more minutes so that we can, if you want to record any comments in the chat or the Q&A, we'd appreciate that. Suggestions for the future. And please do consider becoming members if you are not already members. Anybody becoming a member now, that membership would last till the end of 2023 and cover the cost both of this webinar and any of the subsequent webinars of 2023. Usually we do 4 of them per year. So again, thank you very much. Send us any kind of comments you wish, either through the chat or the Q&A now, or go to our website, find us, and keep in touch. Thank you very much. Thanks, Ian.
I just noticed a question. One of our attendees is asking is, will the slide deck, I'm guessing slide deck that Dr. Braun is speaking from, will that be distributed or available to those who may be interested in receiving it? Or will it be posted?
I think there's 2 answers to that. Our recording of the webinar will be on our website. It always takes us a little while to do it, but eventually it'll be there. And that, of course, does include the slide deck, but it includes much more. It includes all of Ian's discussion of it, and then our Q&A. And then the other point is that if you get in touch with Ian directly, he may be willing to share just the slides.
Great. Hopefully that answers the question as submitted.